Good morning. Most of you probably know me, but in case some of you don't, my name's Clare, wife of Shane, and I've got 4 wonderful children. And yeah, I just hope and pray that what I have to share this morning comes from God and not me. And yeah, we'll just start, I think. Hang on, no, we won't. I forgot this. This might help. Do I just press the first one? Cool. Awesome. I wonder how many of you recognise these little guys. Most of you probably do, just in case you don't. I noticed they've been back on TV lately in an ad campaign by Mitre. They're 2 little guys playing out in the sandpit, but they're acting out the roles of their adult counterparts. And one of them wants to build a retaining wall and is going to get some guy in to do it, but the other one convinces him that, no, we can do it ourselves. And that goes all very well until they ask their Australian friend to come and give them a hand in the weekend, and he says, no, you've got to be joking, mate. And it's a bit of a good-natured play on the sibling rivalry between us and our siblings across the Tasman. But the catchphrase for this ad campaign is DIY, it's in our DNA. And Kiwis apparently have this innate ability to do things themselves. I don't know that I'm the greatest DIYer in the world. I've had my moments. I still remember being at Longburn College and in the dorms, my window catch broke and the maintenance guy was obviously too busy to come and fix it. I got sick of waiting, jumped up on my desk with the back of my hairbrush, and I managed to fix my window that way. That was successful. My DIY antics haven't always been quite successful. Once I was growing up on the farm and came down a hill and round a corner and rode my bike straight through an electric fence tape that was across the cow race, and decided that, being a farm girl, knowing that you couldn't just let the cows go through, I'd better fix it. Worked really well until when I picked up one end of the broken tape. Of course, when I went to pick up the other end, kind of completed the circuit and got a big shock. So yes, sometimes our DIY abilities aren't the best. These days I tend to leave most of the DIY things to my husband, actually. But on a more serious note, I'm going to have to admit something here to our Australian friends, that I don't actually think New Zealanders are the only ones with DIY in our DNA. I don't think Kiwis are the only ones who want to do it ourselves, who have that in our genes. I would like to suggest that all of us as humans, ever since sin came into the world, have this want to do things ourselves, to want to do things the DIY way, and it's something that's been in us ever since sin arrived. I've got to remember to do this. I like to see things as systems, and you'll have to excuse my lack of computer abilities and lack of sort of visual conceptualization skills, but I kind of think God had this awesome system set up where he was here and all the created beings that he had made looked to him, and that was a really good system and it worked really well. And then along came the angel Lucifer, who we now know as Satan, and he thought he had a better system, which looked something like this. He thought, well, why should God be in charge? Why should he be the one that gets to decide everything, and why can't we be in charge of ourselves? Why can't we put ourselves at the centre? And so he came up with this better system, well, he thought. I think we can see in the world around us that it hasn't always worked out as well as yes, he would have liked. But God, as a loving parent, instead of just zapping him and that was it, has given him the chance to see how that goes. And if we look at our world, I don't know if you've heard it said what the main difference is between Christianity and all the other religions. I've heard it said that the main difference is that every other religion looks to man and woman to, through our own efforts, try and reach something, whereas Christianity is looking at God and what he does for us, and he's the one who saves us. So I'm just going to go through some of the major religions just briefly and look at the way they see it. Now, I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. I looked up good old Wikipedia, and if you want to know more, I'm not going to go right through in detail any of these. You can always go and search it out yourselves. But if we look at Islam, Muslims believe that all mankind will be judged on their good and bad deeds. If we look at, why are we not moving? Oh, yes. Buddhism talks about the attainment of this sublime state of nirvana, and it's by practicing the Eightfold Path, doing things yourself once again. And Hinduism looks to the future as a function of current human effort and past human action. So it's that DIY, isn't it? It's trying to do it ourselves, trying to save ourselves. Of course, in our Western society, we see the other religions somewhat, but we can also see a lot of other schools of thought. Where am I meant to be pointing this at? Not sure. Oh, at that. That's why it's not working. Right. Okay. If we look at some of the other schools of thought that are maybe more predominant in our Western society, atheism, basically, it is do it yourself because there's no greater God out there. It's just us. That's it, kind of thing. Evolutionism is basically organisms have evolved from something, just a little slug or whatever it is, into something better, and we've become where we are today through basically our own effort. Humanism is, I had to look up this definition, I didn't really know fully what it was. Oops, and that's on the next screen. Is basically looking to science rather than revelation from a supernatural source to understand the world. So while science is a wonderful thing and it's given us many technological advances and things in the world, the danger is, I think, within the scientific community to see what we have done, that we can figure it all out for ourselves. DIY once again. We can figure it out and we can solve all the world's problems and figure out where we came from via the scientific process. And the New Age movement too, and looks at the individual and their own experience as the primary source of authority on spiritual matters. So that's other religions, but of course most of us probably don't fit into that category. However, even within Christianity, that DIY spirit can kind of enter in. I found this quite interesting. I didn't really know this before I started looking into this. Something called Sola Fide, which is Latin for basically being saved through faith and excluding all works. And it's something that Protestant religions believe. The Catholic Church believes something different. They exclude Sola Fide as the sole grounds for justification. They see grace as important, but it's the gateway to salvation. It's not the only element needed. Adventists, along with other Protestant churches, however, adhere to, amongst some other principles there, to the principle of Sola Fide. We believe we are saved by grace and grace alone, by what God does for us, not by what we do for ourselves, not through DIY. But even within the, here we go. Slides have been changed around a bit, so I'm just getting them right. Even within Protestant churches, we can still find legalism creeps in, and the act of putting law above gospel and establishing requirements for salvation beyond repentance and faith in Jesus. I want to just pause here and look at some of the verses that do teach this. I've got a few of them up there, and I'm not going to go through all of them. The first one, though, sums it up really nicely. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Ephesians 2, verse 8 to 9. And there's some others up there. I'll just go to the last one, which is a really powerful one, I think. It's not by might nor by my power, but not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord Almighty. Zechariah 4, verse 6. It's not by doing it ourselves. It's through God's Spirit. Of course, that begs the question, and it's obviously a question that came up for Paul when he was writing to the churches in the Bible, because he actually answers this question. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? By no means, he says. We can, we we love God and we're not doing things to try and earn his favour. However, when we're in, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. We're in a relationship with God, and therefore we want to do things that will please him. Just like when we're in a relationship with a spouse, we want to do things that we know they're going to like. We don't want to just think, well, how much can I get away with doing? So that's one way of looking at it. The other way, which has occurred to me of looking at it, which is just another angle kind of thing, is if we look at those systems that I talked about earlier, there's a system where we put ourselves at the centre, or there's a system where we put God at the centre. And if we choose to live by the system where we're putting God at the centre and God's in charge of our lives, then we're not going to want to sin, because sin is basically putting ourselves at the centre, if that makes sense. And so we're not doing things to try and earn God's favour. We're just doing them because we know that system is the one that works better, if that kind of makes sense. I struggle to explain it sometimes, but yeah. I want to bring it a little bit closer to home though now, because we've looked at other religions, we've looked at other denominations and schools of thought that teach DIY, basically. But I think most of us don't fit into those categories, and we believe in salvation by grace, but it can still creep into our Christian experience. I haven't got references for any of these because they're not something that you'll find in a textbook as a specific type of religion or school of thought. They're just sort of subtle things that can creep into our Christian experience. The things that I've found in my own experience and that I've struggled with myself at times. The first is believing that we're saved by grace, but that if we don't show our faith through our works, then, well, we mustn't have faith, so then we're not saved. It's a bit of a catch-22, if that makes sense. Trying to prove that we're worthy of God's grace through our works, trying to do it ourselves once again. Then there's believing that we're saved by grace. Oh, actually, I was just going to say something about that other one too. This is kind of, the first one was kind of what I believed when I was growing up, and it wasn't what I was taught, but it's kind of what I ended up believing in my own mind. The message that came through slightly warped from what was being taught to me, if that makes sense. But yeah, then there's believing that we're saved by grace, and because we love him, trying to do what he wants us to do, not trying to do what God wants us to do to be saved, but just doing it because we love him, but trying to do it in our own strength, forgetting that God is the one that can actually give us the power to do what he wants us to do, if that makes sense. And then there's even closer again to the truth, I believe, but just sort of subtly not quite right, is believing that we're saved by grace, and because we love him, trying to do what he wants us to do, but spending a lot of time focusing on doing the right thing, or trying to figure out what's the right thing to do and what's not the right thing to do, and focusing on that stuff instead of focusing on God. And this is the one I really struggle with now, because sometimes you're like, well, does God want me to do this? Does God want me to do that? And instead of saying, hey, God, what do you want me to do? Please show me. I'm trying to figure it out for myself. And I sometimes forget that God's actually there to help me with that. So yeah, I think while we can feel smug about some of the things we talked about earlier, it can easily creep into our own Christian experience. I want to look now at, I forgot to. That was the last one I talked about. The Bible has numerous examples of where God reminds us that it's not doing it ourselves. There's no DIY here. I always find it interesting watching the America's Cup races on TV, because you have these guys who have gazillions of dollars. They're really rich, powerful people, and they kind of think they can call the shots and do whatever they like because they've got all this money, and they can build these huge boats and find people to race them, pay them big money, and then they'll hopefully win a cup. But then you'll get a day where there's just no wind, and they'll be sitting there. They think they're the powerful ones, but I think it's God kind of tapping them on the shoulder and saying, well, hey, actually, you're not in control here, it's me. And yeah, it always reminds me of that. And if we look in the Bible, there's lots of examples of this. If we look at Joshua 6 and the the defeat of Jericho, it wasn't something they did by their might and power and the amazing army. All as they had to do was walk around the walls, and it was God who made those walls come down. If we look at Gideon, that's a classic example of where it wasn't through his might. In fact, God told him he had too many soldiers and sent most of them home, and it was only 300 soldiers that defeated this massive army of Midianites. But it wasn't just an army of 300 soldiers, it was an army of 300 soldiers and God on their side. And if you look at David and Goliath and that completely mismatched fight that really shouldn't have been won by the little guy, it wasn't just the little guy, it was because God was there and he was the one that won that battle for David. And if we come across to the New Testament, we've got Peter, and I love the story of Peter when he came. Jesus was walking on the water and Peter came to him, and Jesus said, "Yep, you can come to me walking on the water." And when he was focused on Jesus, that's when he was fine and he could do it. When he started looking at himself, at his feet, at his friends back in the boat, whatever, not focusing on Jesus, that was when he started to sink. So it's a real reminder to us that we can't do it ourselves. It's not us, it's God that's doing this. And once again, when Jesus was being arrested just before his death, and one of his disciples, Peter I think it was, decided he was going to take this thing by force and went and cut off the ear of the high priest servant or whatever it was, but Jesus reminded him that no, we're not going to do this by force. Okay, it's not a do-it-yourself thing. It's through his power. And yeah, obviously his way of doing things was something that just seemed completely wrong to Peter, but Jesus really did know what he was doing. I want to finish by sharing an illustration, a story, and I want you to imagine for a moment that somebody has invented a motorsport event, a car race, and it's the most grueling, most challenging, most amazing race that's ever been set up in the whole world. It makes the Le Mans 24 hours and Bathurst and everything look like a sprint. It's like massive. And it's a race to the top of this huge mountain. It's going to take weeks. It's just a really mammoth event. And there's a couple of things you need to know about this race. One is that it's open to anybody. It doesn't just have to be professional race drivers. And anyone who gets to the end will receive $10 million. Not just the winner, anyone who reaches the end will get $10 million. Okay, so of course plenty of people decide that it might be a good idea to give this a go. And so you hear of people giving this a go, but stories start filtering back and you hear that somebody's crashed out and failed, and some people come back limping and their cars are all smashed up, and you start to realise after a while there's a whole lot of horror stories coming back, and you actually haven't heard any stories of anybody who's actually reached the end. And other people tend to be a bit sceptical, and they tend to be the people who are actually doing pretty well in their own little lives. They've got plenty of money, so, an extra $10 million, whatever. And they tend to be fairly sceptical of whether this race is actually even worth running. They're not even sure whether the $10 million is there at the end. How do we really know? And they sort of just sit back and in their own little lives. And of course, you decide you could really do with an extra $10 million and maybe you'll give this a go. And so you start off on this race and you discover that, it really is that hard. You're trying to do it and it just, in the end you give up. You decide this is absolutely impossible. Nobody can get to the end. It's all a big have. You can't do it. And so you're sitting back at the start line just sort of thinking, I just give up. And somebody comes along and the guy introduces himself as the son of the guy who had invented this race and set it all up. And he makes you an offer. He says he's willing to drive the race for you. And you look at him a bit sceptical because you think, well, who would ever do that? And what share of the prize does he want? He says, no, it's all for you. I'll do it for you. And so you think, oh, well, yeah, why not? Sweet. And you say, okay, I'll be sitting back here and you can bring me the $10 million when you're done. He says, well, no, you actually have to get in the car with me. You've got to be at the end of the race to actually get the $10 million. So, and then this is when your DIY spirit sort of starts to creep in and you think, well, I can do this. And if this guy wants to give me a hand, well, he can just sit in the passenger seat and I'll drive. And that way, it'll be much cooler if I've got to the end with me driving, not him. But he says, no, if you want me to be in the car, I actually have to be the driver. And so you start off. But sometimes this guy doesn't drive in the way that you would think is the right way to do it, and you're a bit worried, and sometimes you give him helpful hints, and sometimes you kind of say, well, or sometimes you even grab the steering wheel, and when you try that, it always ends pretty badly. But gradually as you go along, you discover that you can trust his driving abilities, and he does know what he's doing, and when you let go and let him have the steering wheel and do it for you, things actually go much better. And the other interesting thing is that as you go along, you gradually start to realise that you're not so much worried about the $10 million because you're actually quite enjoying just getting to know this guy who's your driver. Now, some of you may have figured out, I forgot to change slides, never mind. Some of you may have figured out where I'm going with this story. God is like the person who started this race, and Jesus is the one who's offered to drive for us. Lots of people from other religions, other schools of thought, have tried to run this race on their own, to get in the car themselves, and inevitably they find it's impossible. They never can reach that place on their own. There's others, particularly in our Western society, who decide that, well, they're actually reasonably happy with their little lives as they are. They don't need this extra $10 million, and they tend to be the ones that are quite sceptical of whether this whole thing actually exists. Interestingly though, often these people, when they run out of money or health or whatever it is, that's when they start thinking, well, actually, maybe this isn't a bad idea after all, maybe I should give it a go. As Christians, we're the ones who have chosen to get in the car with the guy that is willing to drive for us, with Jesus. But some Christians want to actually be in the driver's seat and just have Jesus there, giving us some good advice along the way, but we'll still be in control, thanks very much. And then there's those of us who have decided to let Jesus be in charge of our lives. We have let him be in the driver's seat, but it's still very easy to do when something doesn't quite go our way, to kind of want to tell him what to do and, grab hold of the steering wheel every now and then and tell him how to do it our way. But as we get to know Jesus, we can get to know that he does really know what he's talking about, and we can, as we go along, start to trust his driving, his control of our life more and more. And as we go along, we can discover that we're actually not so worried about what happens at the end. We're just really looking for where we get to just enjoy the time we're spending with him and look forward to meeting his Father one day in the future. I hope that that can be where we get to in our Christian lives, that we don't try and do it ourselves, but that we remind ourselves constantly that it's not through us, it's God and God alone. And I want to finish by with a song up on the screen, which I just think sums us up really, really well. Thank you. Dear God, help us to give you all our praise and not to try and do things on our own. Help us to remember that we never can reach anything in life or do anything without you, and that it's not through our own effort, but it's through what you have done for us. Help us to just remember that as we go into this week now. Amen.